First of all, I'd like very much to welcome you to this evening's event. We're delighted that you've been able to come here to this magnificent place for what we hope will be a very stimulating discussion. I'm Maria Wyke. I'm one of the co-directors of the Research Centre on the Dynamics of Civilization, otherwise known as CREDOC, which is based at University College London. My co-director here is Mike Rowlands, and CREDOC is running this event with the support of another UCL research hub, as we sometimes call them, the European Institute, whose executive director, Ute Steiger, has been key to the lively shape we hope this event will take, and is to our delight also able to be here to chair the panel discussion with us. So what I wanted to do first was ask Mike Rowlands if he would say a few words about the context in which this debate is taking place, namely the work of the Centre for the Investigation of the Dynamics of Civilization. Mike, I think there's a...
Just a few words to explain the context. The Centre for Research on the Dynamics of Civilization emerged out of concern with why the concept of civilization had in many ways dropped out of sight. And at the time, about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer, a colleague of mine, Stefan Voigtwang, in the audience, and myself were very involved in trying to create or recreate, or what we call recast, the concept of civilization within the particular context of our own field of anthropology and its links with archaeology and long-term history. I think we are all concerned with trying to understand how civilization also has particularly contemporary relevance. In other words, that the concept has grown and become revitalized, particularly both within its origins, within the sense of the West, but more particularly outside of the West, particularly in China, in Americas, Africa, and South Asia. So we're also very concerned and recognizing that to do a study of this kind within this research center, it has to be comparative, it has to take a focus on the long-term history, deep past, and it also has to recognize why it is a revitalized concept, why it has taken on new forms and new shapes, and they're very complex. And I think this evening, and this is the second of 4 meetings of this kind that we're organizing this year. The first was on China, this one is on Western civilization, but we'll also hold ones on the Middle East and on Africa. So I hope you will also want to, come to some of the others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. So if I just introduce our event this evening, we're told that we live in exceptional political times, times that include emotional appeals to the values of the West and to Western civilization, but fears for the decline of the West or claims that Western values are under threat and need protection are not exceptional. They have a history. And what we seek to do here is to look at these terms, the West, Western civilization, historically, and to look at these terms comparatively in the hope that they will enable us to think in less sensational and we hope more productive terms about the kind of events in relation to which those terms are being summoned into discussion these days. Those sorts of circumstances are things like the vote for Brexit. Is this the end of Western civilization? The election of President Trump, is that the end of civilization? Or is it that Trump says he needs to protect civilization? And perhaps, to some degree, responses to terrorism as an assault on our way of life and our values, and we need to think through quite what we might mean by that. So this evening I want to introduce our speakers in this discussion. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. So first of all, it's Jonathan Bell, who is the director of the Institute of the Americas at UCL and a specialist in the political history of the United States, such as the political transformations brought on by the Cold War, the emergence of American liberalism, and currently, I think, the place of sexuality and gender in the troubled politics of healthcare. On my left, Christopher Brooke is an expert on political theory from the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge, with research interests particularly in the history of political thought in the Enlightenment, including Stoicism, education, and distributive political theory. Jan Kubik, at the far end, is director of the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies at UCL and has research interests particularly in the relationship between politics and culture in social mobilization, collective protest, memory and commemoration, especially in post-European Eastern Europe. I would have said, and here also is Faisal Devji, but unfortunately he has been taken quite ill today and is unable to come and expresses his apologies. He still has research interests in Indian political thought, even though he's not here, and particularly in both Hindu and Muslim political thought, and on issues, for example, of non-violence and violence as proposed and practiced under globalization. So we had very much hoped that we would integrate his, if you like, outside perspective into these discussions. I feel like I should also introduce the room, because the room seems and is quite significant to our discussions. It is an extraordinary room which was originally built to house the library of King George III and then became part of the British Museum as it developed over time. Only a few years ago, the museum decided to dedicate this room to an exhibition on the Enlightenment, hence it's called the Enlightenment Gallery. And the idea was to reveal how travelers and scholars in the 18th century, the age of Enlightenment, collected and classified objects from the world around them, and what consequences that process had for the development of disciplines such as archaeology and for the development of the museum itself. So it's a kind of reflection on the way the museum was established on Enlightenment principles of investigating the world around us. I should say there is a small disadvantage for us in the use of this room. There's no platform for the speakers in case the floor gets damaged, but I hope you can all more or less see us. And there is no red wine at the reception, also for the sake of the floor. So I hope you think that's a price worth paying for being in this room. And mentioning a reception, I should say that at the end of our discussions, there will be a reception without the red wine, to which you are all invited, and the museum simply expects us to depart roughly around 9:15. So, in terms of the format for this evening, now that we begin, instead of a series of talks by each of our panelists, we are shaping this discussion as a series of short question and answers with each of our speakers in turn to set the scene. And then we will open the discussion up between them about the things they've said and then to you, the audience. We're filming the speakers for upload to our UCL website, but we're not filming you in the subsequent discussion, so you can say what you like. So I'll begin, if I may first, with a few questions to pose to Jonathan Bell as our expert in the United States and in American politics to sort of kick off the discussion. And the first question that we wanted to pose to Jonathan was why the concept of Western civilization is currently being employed in the United States in the context of the presidential elections and the arrival of Trump in the White House.
Right, thank you very much, Maria, and hello, everyone. It's kind of interesting to be talking about the notion of civilization in this room in the British Museum. I'm not sure how I feel about that. It might come out in discussion, I think, when we broaden out beyond the West. But I've been asked really to talk very much about the American context, given the current political situation in the United States. It seems that the US is sort of leading the world at the moment in one thing, and that is being in a state of existential crisis over its political future after the election of Donald Trump. And that existential crisis, at least in terms of intellectual debate around politics and around what the current state of the world means for American politics, the notion of Western civilization has been deployed increasingly. I hadn't thought about US history and politics in terms of civilization, really. And I think Mike was referring to this in his opening remarks about how the term and the idea had sort of disappeared from view in a lot of ways. And certainly in an American context, it's one I've just come back to thinking about what I was going to say tonight. But it's come back into political debate after the election of Trump in a big way, both from his supporters and also, of course, from his opponents. Both people who think Trump is a good thing for the United States and those who are saying he's ripping up the social and constitutional fabric of the United States, both have been, interestingly, using the term civilization and even Western civilization to frame their arguments about Trump. For instance, the conservative but very anti-Trump New York Times commentator David Brooks wrote an opinion piece only 6 weeks ago called "The Crisis of Western Civilization," which he felt Trump symbolized this crisis. He felt that historically the United States had symbolized a set of common societal goals, which we might term, or at least he would term, civilization, which were based around things like reasoned discourse, property rights, public square that was religiously inflected, he put it, but not theocratic in its approach. In a sense, a sort of idea of popular democracy that was not rabble-rousing, but reasoned. And he felt this had been undermined well before Trump, but that Trump symbolized its apotheosis and the fact that the United States was now in a position where it could no longer claim to be a beacon of some form of civilization. And yet, interestingly, that same argument about the decline of Western civilization was deployed by many of Trump's supporters. Weirdly enough, for very similar reasons to some of these usually white male opponents of Trump. So the editor of InfoWars, one of the leading alt-right pro-Trump opinion makers, Paul Joseph Watson, argued that the cultural relativism and multiculturalism and what he called Marxist nihilism had caused what he called, it had ended up completely undermining the foundation of Western civilization and leaves us, i.e. the United States, open to subversion and capitulation. So what are we to make of the fact that both people saying that civilization is an anti-Trump and those saying actually Trump is here to rescue Western civilization from cultural relativism and atomization? What does that really mean? And I think it means that actually we need to go back and we really need to critique where are these opinion formers for the United States getting their history of where the United States comes from, and in so doing that, what does that tell us about how concepts like civilization in countries like the United States, how is that actually informing, driving the political development of the country and by extension all the countries that a superpower like the US has interactions with?
Thank you very much. And I think that takes us very neatly to the question about exactly what is the history of the concept in the United States. When we see, as you say, this curiosity about how important it has become in modern debates, but how it's used on both sides, what do we learn from thinking about it in its more historical context, about the way it's been used, the way that in one sense, if one was mapping Western civilization a long time back, the United States would not have been part of it because it was not a part of Europe?
Well, I think this is where we get to my point of view here, which is that current debates over the state of the United States and the state of Western world, and I think very problematic term in itself, those problems and questions and debates are not new. They're certainly not 21st century phenomena. They're actually repeating and recurring features of American political development right from the beginning. The US or the founders of the United States saw themselves as people, descendants, scions of the Enlightenment, and very much appropriators of the Enlightenment from Europe, that they were taking ideas and actually creating a new non-European world out of them, predicated on things like religious freedom, tolerance, the rule of law, constitutionalism, capitalism, of course, and specifically, of course, the absence of feudalism and the sort of societal structures that most of the old world still observed. And in that sense, that ideology of the United States being in some way the beacon of a new post-18th century civilization that would then radiate out into the world, that was born right then. But of course, from the beginning, who was actually creating that discourse of civilization and post-Enlightenment politics? All of them were white, all of them were men. There was, of course, an immediate and open acceptance of slavery. There was an inbuilt distrust, from starting with the Alien and Sedition Acts of the late 18th century, of outsiders and foreigners and potential aliens, dissidents who might undermine the whole American project. And there was the sense that only some people in the world were able to be civilized and integrated easily into American society. The melting pot was a very partial and contrived idea where, of course, people from East Asia, for instance, could be excluded from the United States entirely by law if governing elites felt that that was appropriate to do. And so from the beginning, this idea of included and excluded, part of the democratic constitutional project, and those who are not able to participate in that project have always been in flux, in being redefined, but always there. So the idea of excluding or building walls or saying that there are particular ethnicities, nationalities, religions that are not able to be part of the American project has a very long history. And whether democratic constitutional values can be learned or whether they're innate in some peoples and not in others, again, is something that is hardwired into American political and intellectual debate.
Thank you. So we can see the complexity of the relationship to the concept of Western civilization within the history and the shape and the multiculturalism that lies at the origins of the United States. But one question now is, what are the consequences of using that kind of language in terms of how the United States then sees its relationship to the rest of the world? That is, to what extent has seeing itself as Western and seeing itself as civilized had effects on the way the United States has had its relationships to other countries?
Well, the United States was a late developer in some ways in terms of empire and in terms of establishing the sort of relations with the rest of the world that perhaps this museum symbolizes in part. I think if we think of the United States itself as an empire initially, and the idea of conquering much of the land. There was an impetus then in the late 19th century when there was the end of the frontier and the United States was effectively totally conquered by European settlers to North America. Then there was a move on part of some to look outwards to what can we then do beyond the United States to spread our civilizing mission. Civilizing mission being a religious one that was done privately through missionary activity or through government, particularly when it decided the United States went to war with Spain in 1898 and really then acquired its own imperial possessions for the first time. But of course, that idea of empire and that idea of expansion has always been very controversial in the United States, precisely because of the idea that sometimes that it isn't possible in some Americans' minds to civilize the rest of the world. A very strong part of the motivation for the founding of the Anti-Imperialist League in the late 19th century in the United States was that there were a number of segregationist racists in that group that said, actually, what are we doing into going and bothering with peoples that we don't really want to interact with as Americans? Whereas, of course, those who proposed a greater imperial role also used the idea of American superiority, of the idea of a mission that they could reform, rework, and actually create new worlds out of the areas that they controlled. The Philippines, for example, creating new organs of governance, saying that they would create and give the infrastructure that would allow that country to self-govern in the future. And so that sort of idea of creating, through American governmental action, a forum through which other parts of the world could prosper, develop, and take on American democratic characteristics sort of reached its height with the Cold War after the Second World War. In fact, I was having a look through notes and things from my research thinking about that, and a lot of sort of Cold War liberals, the sort of people who felt that the United States, by and large, was going to be a force for good in the world in the post-World War II era, that it was going to prevent the outbreak of further wars, that it was going to prevent countries from falling to the yoke of communism. One of the prominent intellectuals of that movement, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., wrote an article in 1959 called Our Contribution to Civilization, which he actually listed 10 ways the United States was actually the the creator of modern civilization, from creating a blueprint for revolutions to overthrow dictatorships, through to capitalism, through to multiculturalism, and a variety of other things that he felt this is America's gift, that actually other countries will appreciate our involvement in that. So in a sense, there's been a sort of ambivalence about how the idea of civilization then plays out in an American global mission. But the dominant theme through the 20th and in the 21st century is an activist United States promoting its power will create a world more stable and more organized around principles that American government would recognize.
So I was slightly distracted then by your reference to the article and the list of contributions to civilization, because it just, as a classicist, it just immediately reminds me of the Monty Python discussion about what did the Romans ever do for us. It has a disturbing humor to it all, but it's disturbing. Because one of the questions I think we want to ask now is what then has happened to America's perception of policy towards relations with other countries in the here and now, when, for example, the applicants for establishing the wall between the United States and Mexico, one of those candidates, I think I mentioned in discussions prior to tonight, had said that the purpose of the wall was to protect Western civilization, which is such a horror to see these sort of ideas being expressed in this way. And one of the things I think we're concerned to explore is what now happens when the concept of Western civilization is being utilized in this way by a country with such a huge military capacity, and what kind of foreign policy is being established on that kind of support?
Because this question, remains so confusing to us all, because I didn't buy for a moment the notion that an election of Donald Trump would mean a global retreat from the United States out of involvement in the world, which with certain audiences, of course, he tried to portray that view that the United States had to concentrate on its own people, it had to concentrate on bringing industry back to the United States, it had to concentrate on keeping out undesirable influences from the rest of the world, which were always, of course, heavily racialized in his public discourse and pronouncements. But of course, not only has he turned out to be a more conventional foreign policy leader than perhaps he wanted people to believe during the campaign, I think the raw power of the United States and the projection of that power over such a long period of time is actually impossible to just unravel and change. I mean, it's not a perfect comparison, but I think a good comparison is particularly the British Empire, but a lot of empires actually historically you could look at as well, that there is a way in which there's a sort of almost momentum that takes a long time to actually put a brake on and reverse. And even with Trump in the White House, with the idea of Western values being very much separate from a lot of other parts of the world and the values that at least Trump believes are represented in other parts of the world, there is still a very strong strain of thought in a lot of people around both Trump and around the American political establishment in general, who still very much see American power as something that must be projected and that has a role. And we've already seen that in the Far East since Trump came to power, and also in Syria.
Thank you. And my last question to you for the moment before we turn back to the Enlightenment and to explore a bit further where some of these ideas may have come from or how different they were then. We wanted to ask you, you mentioned in fact that amongst, I think, some of the opponents of Trump, a concern expressed that these ways of thinking and talking about civilization and values are actually a move away from the original founding principles of the United States. And obviously, the United States saw itself as being established by the founding fathers as a representative republic, as based on Enlightenment values like rational thought, deliberative justice, the rule of law. We wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think we've moved, as these critics of Trump themselves have said, that we've moved away from Enlightenment values, or at least that the United States has in this sort of way of thinking, but that actually there are some respects in which moving away from the Enlightenment is necessary in a very changed world?
Well, I think this prompts me to go back to where I started, which is the seeming debate, but in fact non-debate, between opponents and supporters of Trump over this idea of civilization and what Trump means to this. That effectively, if you look at what are the critics, either Brooks or the InfoWars editor that I talked about at the beginning, what are they actually arguing is the cause of the problems? For both of them, so whether they're supportive or not of Trump, it is that effectively there has been a breakdown of dominant consensus over the legacy of the 18th century and over the legacy of the founding of the American Republic. In other words, the consensus, which is basically around excluding otherness and creating a shared sense of values predicated on one particular set of people in a polity, has been challenged by too many other opposing visions. That may be about, of course, race, gender, sexuality, a sense that the whole idea of the West is not and should not be a hegemonic concept. The rise in universities of Africana studies, for instance, of studies around sexuality, of organizing understanding of societies around ideas of gender or ideas of class, ideas that capitalism is not simply just a monolithic given that just organizes American society without any question or challenge. All of those political and intellectual currents that have really grown up over the last 60, 70 years, but they were developing all the way through the American Republic, from suffrage movements in the 19th century through to the challenge to slavery, through to movements for labor justice, for instance, that went right back into all of those have challenged this idea that there is a consensual, agreed vision of what the United States is. That is what the criticism is from those who are arguing out over civilization and Trump. They're saying there used to be a nice consensus, now we're an atomized, fractured citizenry with no shared conception of what an ideal society should look like, and that is bad. I would say, well, I don't see what way out of that dilemma there ever was. That you can't have a 21st century society based principally on 18th century written constitutional values alone. And again, this has come out time and time again, where the courts, which are a wonderful way of looking back at what we have to work with from 18th century America and from the Constitution, where courts have divided over the rights revolutions of the last 100 years, particularly around rights to individual control over their own bodies, over ideas of race, over ideas of different conceptions of family or social relations. When there have been legal divisions, they have usually been between those who want to see we've got to interpret society for the age we're in now versus no, there is an agreed, written, documented universe laid out for us from the beginning that we can still use as the benchmark for what we should be as a society. That is the critical division. And I would say it's kind of, that really symbolizes why there's such a problem. That, you know, we can't just stay with an idea of Western civilization in an American context from that period, because it excludes so much social diversity.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And we'll come back to, I think, some of those very interesting points that you raise about why we need to rethink many of the values of the Enlightenment that have been upheld within this vision of civilization, and come back to that in the discussion later. But now I think Uta would like to ask Christopher Brooks some questions. I'll just sit back so that she can see him. About this issue about what the Enlightenment values consisted of.
Yeah, I just wanted to take the conversation now back precisely beyond that divide that you've just sort of helpfully outlined, which is, 18th century constitutional values, Enlightenment, all of the notions that are being used and mobilized today, as you've outlined. The interesting thing is, so often do we cite those, but what actually was, in your perspective at least, the real actual nature of the Enlightenment vision of civilization? I mean, what and how was that debated to begin with?
Well, one of the things that's very interesting about the word civilization, or the original concept of civilization, is that it isn't quite what a lot of people think that it would be. That it's not a label that gets slapped onto European society to celebrate it. Quite the contrary. It's in the work of Mirabeau, the 18th century physiocrat, in his book on L'Ami des Hommes, the friend of mankind, a book from the period of the 7 Years' War in the later 1750s and early 1760s, that this concept is first elaborated. And what what Mirabeau is using this idea of civilization to do is to suggest that the modern civil society, that's to say the modern European commercial society, the polite society, the polished society, the society of the Enlightenment, if we want to use that language, he's making an argument that this is a society that may be on the brink of barbarism. So far from civility succeeding barbarism, the idea is that this may be a very unstable social form that's going to repeat the catastrophic trajectory that ancient Rome found herself on. And Mirabeau uses this word civilization to describe his alternative to the deeply flawed present. Now, by the 1750s, there were all kinds of stories that people have to tell about how modern society may destroy itself. Sometimes they're straightforwardly along the lines of the ancient world where luxury is going to corrupt, luxurious consumption is going to corrupt morals and undermine the basis of society. Sometimes there are arguments about how the enormous public debts that the monarchs in 18th century Europe, the King of England or the King of France, were running up to fight their wars. We now know how states handle massive debts, but in the 18th century these debts were fairly new, and it increasingly looked as if there was no serious prospect that these debts could be paid off. Of course, the French Revolution, which destroyed the French monarchy, has its origin in the debt crisis, so these weren't unreasonable fears at all. There are anxieties about modern commerce, both European commerce and international commerce, and the way in which the pressures of what we now call globalization, although they don't call it that then, that can create enormous pressures on modern societies. So lots of people have these, there's a number of different arguments around in the 1750s about why the polite commercial societies of the 18th century may be on a trajectory towards a complete social smash-up. And Mirabeau coins this word civilization in order to try and explain what modern French society, modern European commercial society is lacking. It's lacking the right kind of moral dimension. It's lacking the kind of robust social bonds that will be able to hold modern society together. And Mirabeau wants to argue that that religion is extremely important for the roots of civilization, what he thinks that Europe is lacking. And he's one of the physiocrats, he's one of these French economists who thinks that a great part of the problem of modern Europe is that industrial and agricultural development are out of whack with one another, that France in particular has become a society where agriculture is not developing in a healthy way. The French countryside is increasingly depopulated. The government is running a commercial policy that is all about promoting the interests of manufacturing interests in the towns, especially manufacturing interests that are involved in producing luxury goods, both for the domestic and for the international market. And so one of the kind of argument Mirabeau is making is an argument about how a certain program of massive agricultural reform needs to be embarked upon in France, which will help to rein in, restrain the forces that he thinks have put France on a catastrophic trajectory. So from Mirabeau's point of view, modern civil society doesn't succeed barbarism, it threatens to be succeeded by barbarism. And civilization is this alternative future that France might have that will save it from barbarism. And to connect it up to the United States, I mean, this is one of the reasons why so many people in the later 18th century are quite so optimistic about the future of the United States, because it's a country with enormous reserves of agricultural land. And if you want a society where, as it were, agricultural development and agricultural prosperity fuels the development of industry, but very much with an agriculture-first approach, there's a great deal of anxiety that Europe is heading off in the wrong direction, and the Americans may be able to get themselves on a developmental trajectory that will adequately address some of those difficulties.
It's fascinating in some respects to see those parallel discourses, I mean, of the globalizing economy as a threat. I mean, even if those weren't the terms that they used, effectively that's what Mirabeau seems to suggest. In that sense, he is also seemingly in tune with Rousseau, who seems to suggest in his early writings, at least, that that the optimism of the Enlightenment and the sort of progress of the Enlightenment is something that needs to be tackled rather than celebrated. But then I think you have suggested also that that might not be just the full story, that he didn't argue for a return to the good.
No, that's right. I mean, there are people in in what we now call the French Enlightenment who are celebrating a lot of aspects of commercial modernity, and Voltaire would be a good example of that. But there's a whole host of people who are very skeptical about the dynamics of 18th century society. This received idea we have today that the 18th century is this great period of enlightenment, of optimism, of belief in progress and rationality, it gives us an extraordinarily one-sided view of the actual debates that were going on at the time. You've mentioned Rousseau, and he's the most celebrated critic of this naive faith in progress in the 18th century. Rousseau becomes a Europe-wide celebrity in the early 1750s with his discourse on the arts and the sciences, which attacks the idea that the development of the arts and the sciences helps to purify or to improve morals. And then in 1755, so shortly before Mirabeau publishes his book, he publishes what many people consider his masterpiece, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, which is an argument about how the modern commercial societies can never be stabilized by the kind of reform programs that were being battered around in those days, and that Rousseau foresaw an era of revolutions, but not, he doesn't have an idea that revolutions generate anything positive or desirable, or they're not progressive anyway. Rather, he thinks there's going to be this oscillation between a series of revolutions that will lead to an oscillation between radical, unstable democracies on the one hand and military despotisms on the other hand. But even here, he's tapping, in some ways Rousseau is a radically original figure, but he's tapping into older arguments. In particular, a huge number of people in France in the 18th century have this anxiety that the French countryside is going wrong. This is a world in which the vast majority of the population still lives in the countryside. And whether it's from writers like Fénelon in 1699 with his book Telemachus, or Montesquieu with his book The Spirit of the Laws in 1748, there's this widespread agreement that the depopulation of the French countryside is likely to have disastrous consequences, and it's going to take something very dramatic to get France heading in the right direction. This is a discourse. This is an argument where people are very worried about the future of the French monarchy. They have premonitions that something disastrous is going to happen, and indeed in 1789 the revolution does set in motion a chain of events that leads to the downfall of the monarchy. That's the kind of social collapse or political collapse that these earlier writers do seem to be quite nervous about.
It's interesting, obviously, now you mentioned the French Revolution. It's sort of the symbol for another possibly received opinion while we're on deconstructing opinions of the Enlightenment. Another received opinion on the Enlightenment is that sort of sense of the opposition between the enlightened rationalist ideal of a republic and the actual sort of raw emotions that the bloody revolution at the end of the 18th century then brought. Is that too simplistic a view? Is there a better way of understanding that opposition?
It is too simplistic. It's one-sided, and so from the one hand you can say that the French Revolution is what happens when raw passion and emotions and demagoguery and so on are left to run unchecked. And in the early part of the 1790s, people start discussing whether the National Assembly, whether the French National Convention is a rerun of Athenian democracy, and this is still at a time when Athenian democracy is widely regarded as a kind of mob rule. But the other side of the coin is that to the eyes of others, it's the opposite problem. It's precisely that the revolutionaries are proclaiming rationalist abstract ideals of freedom and equality, and what they're forgetting is that societies are held together by custom, prejudice, opinion, and so on. The conservative critique of the revolution has always come from that angle. Edmund Burke is the most famous critic of the French Revolution from this point of view. So it's always it's an argument that you can run in either direction. But just to take a step back into the more rarefied world of Enlightenment theory, again, this is another of those cliches that we need to be much more critical of, that again, people have this idea that the theories of the Enlightenment are rationalist, optimistic, progressive, and so on. But actually, if you look at the main philosophies that were adumbrated, they're skeptical, and they often want to dethrone the role of reason and focus on the absolute centrality of the passions for understanding human society and politics. And Pierre Bayle's skepticism at the turn of the 18th century is a very important route for a lot of that. But a figure like David Hume or Adam Smith, who produced theories of moral sentiments, Rousseau argues for the centrality of understanding the passions, in particular the different varieties of self-love that we have for understanding modern societies. And even someone like Immanuel Kant, who's often held up as the symbol of 18th century rationalism, we shouldn't forget that his books are all called A Critique of Reason, his Critique of Pure Reason or his Critique of Practical Reason. These are books that are trying to establish the domain in which you can make certain kinds of rational arguments, and it's not always an especially expansive domain. So again, what has come down to us in sort of popular conceptions of the 18th century is often radically one-sided and often extremely misleading. And when we help ourselves, when we work back towards a more complex understanding of what is going on in the 18th century, then we're also likely to find that it doesn't neatly map on to political positions that are staked out in the present.
I think that's going to be really useful as well when we talk about populism, because populism is so often cast in that precise mold of, just unreflected rage against, sort of an irrationally motivated political establishment. So I think it's useful to break these categories down. But maybe my last question to you is also on breaking categories down. I'm interested in understanding to what extent in the Enlightenment already there is a sort of self-understanding of civilization. It's something that somehow distinguishes the West and the rest, or is that an imposition that we now retrospectively make?
No, that's right. So the origins of the word civilization lie in this critique of the way modern-day France is organized. But there is another body of theory that becomes extremely important for the way people in the 19th century think about civilization, that also emerges in precisely this period in the middle of the 18th century. And that's the so-called Scottish four stages theory. It's associated with the figure of Lord Keynes in the Scottish Enlightenment, but also the better-known figure of Adam Smith. And the idea of four stages theory is that there's this developmental sequence that societies pass through. So they begin as hunter-gatherer societies, then they move to a pastoral form of organization, so where shepherding, where flocks of animals are the main wealth. After pastoralism comes settled agriculture, and then in these agricultural societies there develops a commerce, and you have the passage from agricultural to commercial society. And In the 18th century, we get these very sophisticated attempts to, so if you think, for example, about the lectures that Adam Smith gives at the University of Glasgow on jurisprudence, he's trying to show how in the earliest legal records we have, they were always reflective of the different stages of society that societies have reached. We don't hear much about four stages theory these days outside universities, but a lot of people are familiar with the 19th century twist on four stages theory, which is called Marxism. I mean, Marx takes that schema and presents it as a series of different modes of production. And then he thinks that commercial society is not the final social stage. He thinks it's the he calls it the capitalist mode of production. And then he argues that it's going to be succeeded by a modern form of socialism. But he's very much building on these 18th century foundations. It's that four stages theory that gets, as well as people like Smith and these Scottish scholars, reaching back into the histories of European societies to try and find evidence of these old legal codes and so on. But this is also a discourse where people get very interested in, this is also a discourse that stands at the roots of what later becomes anthropology, this interest in non-European societies, this interest in peoples around the world who still seem to be at one of the earlier stages, still at a hunting stage or of development. And this begins these research projects to try and understand them. And this all serves, I think, as background for the world of 19th century imperialism, when you have this idea that civilization it's the name of a process of civilizational development. It's also the name of a status, that some people are civilized in the ways that some other people are not. You get these arguments about how the role of Europeans may be to assist other peoples along this developmental pathway, and that gives rise to the language of the civilizing mission that Jonathan mentioned earlier. And that, I think, is how this distinctive world of 18th century four stages theory feeds into the later arguments about European imperialism in the 19th century, that really are the immediate ancestor to the way that civilization gets talked about today, with this in a way that it's very difficult to make the break between arguments about Western civilization and arguments about empire of one kind or another.
Thank you, Christopher. This is fantastic. I'm sure we can come back to some of this later on. But while I'm in the business of deconstructing received opinions, can I just turn to you, Jan, as well? Because one of the things that we do tend to suppose, and I suppose sitting in the Enlightenment gallery here and on a sort of Western civilization panel, is that the concept of the Enlightenment really has emerged from the West and then by extension from Western Europe. Might we be taking a bit of a broad brush approach here if we phrase it that way?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here in this room, which I visited first time, in 74, I think. Let me take it in a slightly personal way, in the following sense. I am now working on trying to understand the phenomenon of the rise of populism, particularly the right-wing populism. And in order to do that, you have to have sort of the other of populism in your head. And I'm trying to understand how it works in my head. And obviously it has something to do with rationality, moderation, some of the values of the Enlightenment. So I started thinking about, what is the Enlightenment, the residue of the Enlightenment in my head, and where is it coming from? And I come from a periphery. I come from Poland. I was going to high school there, and the first time you encounter the Enlightenment is in high school. And you encounter it in a very powerful way, because some of you may know, maybe you all know, that in 1795 Poland, or Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, disappears from the map of Europe for 100 some years. And the reason for that, you learn at school, is that there was not enough enlightenment, in a way, that it was not taken seriously enough, that there was a very serious series of publications, all kinds of actions. The king was involved on the side of the Enlightenment values, there was a great constitution, May 3rd Constitution of 1791, one of the first Enlightenment constitutions, really. And also all of this is in vain, it's too late, and then Poland disappears under the forces of, as it was sometimes described, anti-Enlightenment. So first you get this kind of very positive message that Enlightenment is a great thing, and this is something that, well, came too late to the peripheral country, although, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was huge. But anyway, in the terms of the growth, I guess, of the Western civilization, somehow on the side. And then I go to university and I study sociology and philosophy in Krakow. And again, you learn more or less that the Enlightenment is, well, a specific thing, something basically positive, because I study the university, which has a very powerful tradition of logic. So kind of rationality is very much valued, and we learn all those kind of ideas and methods that are associated with the Enlightenment. Although we are beginning to read, of course, and all of this is in the kind of increasingly heavy source around us of official Marxism and Marxist-Leninism. So then you're beginning to think, what the heck is this Marxist-Leninism, which is so crazy and produces all those undesired, makes our lives so miserable. And then you learn a lot, we've learned a lot about Marx, and you are beginning to think that, Marxism is the Enlightenment gone mad, completely mad, and that does awful things. So there's this kind of negative thing about the Enlightenment. Then you also start reading in the underground, some publications of the Frankfurt School, and of course this is the first time I encountered Adorno and Horkheimer, the dialectic of the Enlightenment, which is a different understanding of Enlightenment, but has something to do, of course, with the criticism of the Enlightenment that tends to become rather stiff and becomes a myth itself, right? That's what the point is. Then I go to New York and I study anthropology at Columbia, and I entered the graduate school at the time where the main thing you do is the bashing Enlightenment, as much as you can in the name of all kind of, the Enlightenment is seen as the system of thought that is behind the cultural imperialism of the West. I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but roughly that's the idea. So then at the end, you are, and I am still, I suppose, a little bit kind of, if not confused, at least I sense those enormous ambiguities. And then the final thing, with my students here at UCL, we are reading Sebastian Conrad's a really great piece in the American Historical Review about how to properly understand the Enlightenment. And then he goes very usefully, I very much recommend this piece. First, it is traditional understanding, which is emancipatory modernization. It's the good kind of good Enlightenment. Then you have critical post-colonial views, and sort of you get this cultural imperialism story. Then you get to the third understanding, which is that there's no one modernity, that there are different modernities, multiple modernities. And finally, the observation comes, and this is my main point, that all of this assumes that the Enlightenment was somehow developed and practiced in kind of silos, isolated vessels. Maybe it wasn't just Paris or Königsberg or this or that. Maybe some of it was in Vienna, maybe some of it in Warsaw, some of it in Prague, but maybe also in Beijing, maybe in Tokyo, maybe somewhere else. And the Conrad's point is that we should understand the Enlightenment in the new way as an incredibly, the way I see it, complex field of forces, which has some beginning somewhere, but then it kind of cascades into new parts of the world, including China, the Ottoman Empire, Japan, but in my case, most interestingly, the Habsburg Empire and maybe the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which kind of got it perhaps too late. So you get the main concept is connections, connectivities, and the destruction of boundaries. And the kind of doubt that once you figure out the beginning, you understand everything about the dynamic of the Enlightenment. So that's, then you come to the point, and so what do I take from this, all of this? To think about the danger to reason? Well, I think what you take from this is that, yes, we need reason to resist what is happening around us in terms of the, in this case, rise of right-wing populism, but we cannot forget that the reason itself can be extremely dangerous to itself, right? So that there's this kind of dynamic that I guess never leaves us.
You describe in some respect the Enlightenment as much more sort of multi-centered and varied, geographically, conceptually as well. If you mentioned Königsberg, but and this is obviously Königsberg, the place of Immanuel Kant. When we talked about this earlier, you also mentioned Riga. Do you want to kind of talk about the way that we might take those kind of varied geographies quite literally sometimes, in the way that one might map out both sort of the ways that Enlightenment thought develops in Europe, but also its counterpart, Romanticism develops, and how one might understand that some of the things that still sort of worry or concern us today can still be understood in that dynamic between those two different trajectories.
So, as it was already mentioned, we should try to avoid those dualisms, at least not to attach too much attention to that the period of the Enlightenment in itself is full of tensions and kind of conflicts of various ways of thinking, although the dominant mode, I guess, is the classical, the Enlightenment way of thinking, based on rationalism, empiricism, trying to figure out the proper sort of arrangement of the political system, which, by the way, although in the 70s even in Poland, we were not allowed to read officially John Locke. We could read the essay on the understanding, but we couldn't read his political essays. So we read them in the underground or things like that. But for me as an anthropologist, more than anything else, that story between Königsberg and Riga is very, very important, because Johannes Herder, who is sometimes seen as the one of these forefathers of anthropology, was Kant students in Königsberg, and then for a while he lived in Riga, capital of Latvia, and I went to the house where he lived. Well, the story is perhaps a little bit apocryphal, but at that time he started writing about the necessity of understanding human history through very careful reconstruction of ethnic or national groupings and giving them the right kind of place under the sun against Kantian kind of universalism, right? That is how it's usually set up. So he walks around and he observes people, dancing, singing, and he begins to introduce the concept of folk cultures as the foundation of the development of ethnic group, national nations, and so on. And this way sets up this incredibly powerful opposition, which we know we should not kind of reify in our own intellectual discourse, but I, as a student of the political frames and ideologies used by social movements, observe those binaries, those polarizations all the time. And I think that this is why this is so important to understand, say, the dynamic of the Enlightenment, which is sort of the philosophy of the mind, of reason, versus Romanticism, which is more, of course, the philosophy of the heart. And this is, in a way, again, Kant versus Herder. But, one thing that I've always been interested in, another distinction is because I study a lot of symbols, and so Ernst Cassirer is a very important thinker for me. And you may be aware that in 1929 in Davos he debates Heidegger, the famous debate. Before today I was kind of rereading the accounts of all of this. And this debate basically, in a general sense, repeats in 1929 the same binarism, right? Heidegger, we know which way he went. Cassirer had to left Germany. And you read this language and you hear the rhetoric coming, not used by Heidegger in Davos, but then by his colleagues, acolytes, journalists, that Kazire represents this universalistic Jewish science. So you have the motive of anti-Semitism, which plays such a fundamental role in the rise of right-wing populism, certainly in Europe and certainly in Central Europe, in Poland and Hungary and places like that. And what then you think, what weapons do you have against that, right? And then you go back to the values of the Enlightenment. I cannot come up with anything better. So, this moment of doubt, which I went through in graduate school, where the Enlightenment and its values were mostly seen, mostly, not exclusively, as the intellectual foundation of cultural imperialism. But I guess now we need to maybe go back and start recovering for today, for the present time, those ideas because of the Enlightenment, because without them, I am not sure how to fight this wave of unreason that we all talk about.
As an anthropologist, you study the way that the people draw on those notions and sort of mobilize specific concepts for their own purposes. And I think the interesting thing I'd like to sort of hear more about is to what extent those notions that you've sort of described are still being mobilized today, and how can we sort of make sense of them in order to critique them. You say you don't quite know how to tackle and react to it, but maybe understanding how they're set up will help us in some ways, identifying the strategies that they're using.
Well, by now I've participated in more conferences on the rise of right-wing populism than I remember. Mm-hmm. I just came back from one in Germany 2 days ago. And you are learning all the time, and your understanding improves at each turn. I think what everybody observes in various ways is that you have increasingly the division, and we already talked about it, in the various societies where many people are beginning to see the elites as betraying them, right? Which is kind of important because the elites may be saying we're doing things in the name of reason. So again, reason comes in, and it's the kind of driving force of elites saying, well, we'll do things this way, we'll do things that way, we know better. Experts, right? And then people are beginning to look around them, and they're beginning to see the world that is full of uncertainty, the world that generates enormous amount of threats. It seems like there are more threats around us now than even a few years ago. And you have this clash of one student researcher of populism calls the arrogance of ignorance on the one hand, right? Those kind of, I will talk a little bit more about it in a moment. And then you have obviously the arrogance of elites, arrogance of experts, arrogance of knowing more, knowing better. And it is a tremendous dilemma. But then arrogance of ignorance, our job is to try to understand it. And okay, so people, increasing numbers of people, I just got most recent data on they were published in the Washington Post today on Trump's electorate. This is not poor people, right? This is not very well educated people, but not poor. But that's the basic conclusion of that study. The same thing in Poland. I look at the data, the same thing in Poland. So you don't have this is not the rebellion of the poor. This is not only the rebellion of those who are the losers in this or that context. There's something more going on. But there's, we often hear this word in the interviews. Materially, I'm not really in such a bad shape. But I don't know what it's all about. I don't understand the world anymore. I don't understand that. Someone needs to give me the meaning of it, a sense. I'm looking for sense. And then what you have is populist politicians. For me, the populism is a phenomenon of unscrupulous political manipulators or political entrepreneurs, if you want to call, who are mercilessly exploiting this moment of crisis. I'm putting it deliberately in such stark terms, and offer them idiotically, I would say, simple solutions. Playing on this ignorance that we sometimes see is in a way generated by those politicians or priests, some journalists, intellectual elites, some artists even. It happens, more on the right-wing side. And again, the question then becomes, how do you counteract that? Right? And how do you ask people to listen to reason, at least some elements of it, in the situation of this heightened emotionality? It is extremely difficult. The emotional side of things has tremendous symbols. Religion, nation, those are extremely powerful symbols. What are the great symbols of reason and moderation? Right? How do you visualize it even? Well, that's, I guess, the problem.
Thank you very much, Jan. I mean, I feel in some respects we're doing a bit of a full circle again back to Jonathan's last point on how the sort of consensus and democratic culture is sort of broken up, and both sides stand before it and try to sort of approach that problem for their own ends without having a very clear idea of how to bring this forward. It's a shame that Faisal isn't here, who was going to really bring us into the debate of a non-European perspective on this. And interestingly, he was going to start by discussing Gandhi. And I've got to sort of think of another apocryphal quote attributed to Gandhi, in which he was asked, what do you think about Western civilization? And he answered, I think it would be a very good idea. And in some respects, we still seem to be thinking around the idea of the Enlightenment. I think we wanted to open up discussion among the panel first, and maybe you, Maria, can bring in some of what Faisal was going to say to get us going.
Yes, I think what we want to do is just to sort of wrap up the panel discussion and bring you into our conversation. I feel I might slightly lower the tone here, because what I wanted after such really interesting discussions, I just had like 3 points I wanted to pick out of what I understood Faisal might have been saying if he'd been here, because I think they're important ones to make. One was that in talking about Gandhi, he was discussing the way in which Gandhi saw the West as identified with industrial capitalism, and that he saw industrial capitalism as chewing up all other civilizations and then being incapable of controlling its own. So in that sense, the apocryphal story was about it would be a good thing if the West managed to have any civilization at all, because it doesn't have one. I think also one of the interesting things that came out of our initial conversations with him was the colonial response to the values of the Enlightenment, the way in which the colonies often saw that the supposed universal values that they saw espoused by the Enlightenment were not ones that were offered to the colonies, such as liberty, and that often it was the colonies that would fight for what were considered to be the Enlightenment values and claim them as their own, in considerable contrast to the concept of the civilizing mission. He was also very interested in thinking about the ways in which changes had emerged as to who the opponents of Western civilization might be after the Cold War period, so that we saw with Jonathan that this strong interest in the rise of these ideas of Western civilization in the Cold War period in opposition to communism, and that subsequently we can see in the post-Cold War period that Islam is made to take the place of communism even when it's far too simplistic for it to do so, because it is a very different kind of entity. He was also interested in talking about how Islam and our concept of Islam is quite different from the idea of Western civilization. So one cannot think in terms of a clash because there are very different sorts of entities. That Islam has no national boundaries, it's not geographically defined. And so I think what I wanted to think about at the end was that Anthony Appiah, when he was here last year, gave some talks in which one of the things he said was Western civilization doesn't exist, because the use of the term the West is really a way of identifying whites and Christianity against the rest. And so the rest are in fact not geographically in the East, but in all sorts of parts of the world, even within the West, depending on who is speaking as a Westerner. And he was advocating that we completely abandon the concept of the West. And so I think the question I wanted to ask here, and just to ask our panel before we open it up, is should we be continuing to think that there's a Western civilization today? If it's important to think in those terms, how would we map it? If we felt we needed to separate the idea of the West from civilization, do we need the terminology of civilization now? Should we be going back to Mirabeau and saying civilization is the thing that might save us all, whoever we are, white and non-white, male and female, Christian or non-Christian, that maybe we should reconsider what civilization precisely might mean? So I think perhaps if we could just ask our panelists. Chris?
Ideas of the West, I mean, there are these concepts that are sometimes used to try to construct explanations of things and sometimes freighted with normative value. And what we want to hold on to and what we want to get rid of can be complicated. If we're interested in telling very long-term stories about why it's countries in the northern and western parts of Europe that end up conquering the rest of the world rather than other countries, other parts of the world that end up conquering Europe, we'll be looking to construct large-scale historical explanations, and we might use the idea of the West as a shorthand for some of that. I don't think there's a great deal wrong with doing that. But when we look at how the idea of the West or the idea of Western civilization is something that floats around today, that gets invested with a lot of political or ideological or normative content, sure, that's a big chunk of ideology that we almost certainly would do better without. I don't think much that's edifying or illuminating comes out of the kind of arguments that Jonathan is talking about in contemporary American politics. And it would be good to have people thinking about different kinds of vocabulary, different kinds of language they can use to articulate their disagreements. So I'm broadly sympathetic with Appiah's ambition, but there may be a throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of issue somewhere along the way.
Yeah, I would second, first of all, the idea that these sorts of terms have explanatory power, but that doesn't mean we should go along with some of the ideological and political assumptions that are inherent in how they're used, particularly in politics. I don't think we need to do that, but we can certainly chart at the complex ways in which terms and discourses have been used and have shaped how history has evolved and happened over time. So in that sense, that's why we're here to talk about these terms, because they have explanatory power and they have value to us as we try and interpret the world. But yeah, as I sort of the sort of figures that have been using these terms in sort of political debates have basically infused them with the sense that there is a correct, right, and hopefully they would say consensual way through a thicket of societal complications that I think cannot be. They can't be a consensual way through using terms like the West or civilization, because they are completely loaded with normative assumptions about how societies should function, and of course how societies should interact with each other as well, and that is really problematic.
Well, yes, and I do not find the term West particularly useful, but it is an interesting object to observe how it works in the discourse of this or that group of people. But at the same time, again, looking at that point, the departure point about trying to understand something that perhaps is the crisis of some kind, if you would have to try to figure out what the West is, it is something very ambiguous. It has both kind of positive and negative, quite destructive sides to it, right? And then you have this history of capitalism and colonialism and all of this, which has an enormous negative consequences around the globe in various sort of intensities. You have the place of tremendous religious wars, right? But on the other hand, when you think about the religious wars, beginning with the Reformation, say, you are beginning to see the emergence of some ideas how to contain that situation, right? A lot of political thought emerges from the context of this tension between Catholicism, Protestantism, or on the edge of orthodoxy. And you get this very positive intellectual trend that leads to the ideas that we still, I think, largely cherish, like checks and balances, controls on those who have power, the concept of liberal democracy as democracy somehow not of the majority, but the majority controlled by the rule of law, right? Those are tremendous achievements. And, for me, growing up under communism, I will never kind of give up on those ideas, right? So this is something that when I see it threatened again, and now I started reading books about the late 1920s and 30s in Germany again, then you are beginning to be a little bit nervous, right? That maybe those positive sides of the vaguely defined West are worth sort of, I don't know, standing up for and fighting for a little bit.
But we do have to be careful with these narratives of fairly uncomplicated progress. You've talked about the trajectory going from the wars of religion through to then a world of representative government and checks and balances and so on. But some of the most interesting arguments are always about how the immense destructiveness of European wars and the process of political development that you're describing are intimately related. And you get this in 18th century writers like Adam Smith or Immanuel Kant, who are clear in their own minds that it is the fact that the European countries are always going to war with one another and the wars are incredibly expensive, and they think that that's part of the dynamic that's producing the rise of constitutional government, representative government, accountable government, because as warfare becomes ever more expensive and government budgets become ever larger and government debt becomes ever higher, there's more and more pressure from the people who are footing the bill, who are paying the taxes, to make that government accountable. So it's never a simple story of the move from 16th and 17th century religious bigotry to 18th and 19th century constitutionalism. Rather, a lot of the most interesting theories are always about how the particularly belligerent geopolitics of Europe are in fact driving the process that's leading to what we would recognize as liberalism, constitutionalism, representative government, and so on. It's always a double-edged story.
No, I completely agree. But, the point is, I guess, once those ideas emerge, the way you're describing, I think I understand it somewhat similar way, then they are useful elsewhere. Like they're detached from their context of origin and can be applied as kind of guiding principles somewhere else. and then they function somewhat differently, but they're still useful ideas in that sense, I think.
I think one of the things I was so struck by is how some of the themes occur again and again. And one of them is that sort of tension that we have in today's discourse a lot, of course, which is on the compatibility or not of a very liberal, very globalized economy and commerce and the understanding of a political community that still is based on a certain sentiment of community, even obviously no longer homogeneous in the greatest sense. What we see today is that resurgence of the discourse of bounded community through a nationalism or more extreme versions. So that is, in some respects, something that takes us really from the origins in the 18th century on to where we are now. The question is, are there any lessons to be learned, if you like, from the way that those previous dilemmas were being addressed, that we could take over into our 21st century today? I mean, in terms of inequality, possibly in the way that those sort of root causes are there that might be addressed with some sort of response.
Well, I think that's one of the problems with contemporary politics in a lot of places, certainly in this country as well as the US and elsewhere, where you're thinking, why is there so much political traction both for sort of nativist right-wing populism and various forms of what we might call loosely left insurgency of various kinds, from kind of Bernie Sanders through to Corbyn and so on. Why are there these sort of energies that seem to almost be feeding off each other? And one of the reasons for that is this sense that there is a fundamental problem of inequality related to global interdependence and global capitalism and global flows of money, that is creating a political and cultural and social crisis. But of course, how do you deal with those crises at the national or state level when everything is so interconnected with what's going on elsewhere? And in fact, you can see both right-wing populism and left activism struggling with the same questions, and almost, you can almost see in some cases overlapping between them, because they are, well, how do we have a national discourse that we can deal with questions that we can't control at the national level? And that seems to be coming back time and time again in an interconnected global economy where so much labour can be moved about, or investment can be moved at the drop of a hat, or things can completely be relocated or rethought on the basis of profit margins. Once you have that, these sorts of stories of national movements or one state benefiting from a war or whatever that then forces it to rethink everything, that just isn't really all politicians are struggling with what to do about that.
Sorry, did you?
Well, just briefly. I mean, we always do come back to the political choices of the 18th century. The 18th century is when there's widespread awareness that the rise of modern commerce fundamentally reshapes modern politics, and two of the political models that are explored in the 18th century. One of them is the idea of a European Union, the idea that a European confederation that is more than an alliance but not quite a single state can be the basis of peace and prosperity in Europe, can bring an end to the cycles of European warfighting. That's the vision above all associated with the Abbé de Saint-Pierre. And that's in a sense, that lies behind the story about Brexit, the United Kingdom deciding it doesn't want to be part of that kind of Pacific Union anymore. At the other end of the 18th century, in 1800, Fichte publishes his book on the closed commercial state. And Fichte's argument is that the way to enjoy the benefits of modern commerce without getting sucked into the kinds of international conflicts that modern commerce generates is to have a closed economy, so to have commercial life, but with the state absolutely regulating any cross-border traffic in goods and doing without it wherever possible. And the closed commercial state is the vision that's designed to harness the benefits both of modern economic life as it's set out by someone like Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, but also the vision of egalitarian republicanism that you find in the political thought of figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. And it's well worth thinking about whether we're going to hear more proposals that sound a bit like the closed commercial state in the not too distant future.
Can I just add one thing? Well, if you look at the existing research, a bit of it at least, that I've looked at on the causes of the rise of right-wing populism, the economic explanations alone do not work. I mean, they provide some part of the explanation, but it seems that you have to add to this mix of explanatory factors, cultural factors, which of course makes me happy as a cultural anthropologist. But what are those factors? What is often mentioned is what this thing that I talked about, this loss of sense, and particularly the loss of status. So there's, for example, a research, again, in the United States that shows that the men are increasingly upset that they're losing status to women. The whites are increasingly upset that they're losing status to the blacks, Hispanics, people of different colors. And finally, what is very interesting, the Americans increasingly are beginning to be nervous that they are losing the status of number one in the world, or whatever they were thinking about themselves, but that they are now challenged seriously. And this anxiety is sometimes, of course, linked to the rising inequality, which is definitely rising also, and to certain areas of poverty, but not only. Again, there's quite a bit of a middle class or people with relatively well-to-do who are feeling threatened, and they voted for Trump.
Well, on that note, I think it might be an appropriate moment to open up to questions to the panelists about any part of the things that they've been saying in the course of the evening. I think we've got a microphone available. Rosie, are you all right to pick it up? Can we, any questions for anyone on the panel, or for all of the panel in various shapes and forms? Stefan.
I was wondering how your more scholastically or scholarly information can be used to do something about the way in which civilization is used by populist politicians. If at all. I mean, I'm not saying it should be. I'm just thinking how useful politically is your scholarship?
We get us started on this one.
Okay. Yeah, I've been thinking about it, and I think it is simple in a way. And what scares me about the Western universities, or the universities in general, is that we are beginning to underplay the significance of teaching the humanities, philosophy, political philosophy, civics, broadly understood, to make people understand all those things we are talking about, our students. The students are increasingly concentrated on obtaining some kind of technical specialized knowledge. There are many students who do not study social sciences and humanities at all. I go to all kinds of meetings where we're talking about this and that at the university, and then I realize I'm the only social scientist in the room. And they're talking about the interface between the university, industry, and this and that, and all kinds of issues that have nothing to do with putting a lot of, I think, necessary effort to creating citizens, not just experts and specialists in this and that.
Can I just say that I think that's a very interesting point, because I think many universities are aware that at the time of the vote over Brexit, universities didn't contribute sufficiently in the public domain to debates, or didn't find a way to voice what they saw as a sort of a richer, more complicated awareness of what might be at stake in being in the European Union or being out of it. So I think there's already an awareness that the universities have to work harder at finding channels to speak on issues where they might have a significant role to play in public debate.
Can I just add to that? I think part of the difficulty in all of this is quite appropriate in this room, is the notion of the echo chambers, that we do tend to speak to those who we already sort of more or less agree with, and the sources that we don't usually, we wouldn't probably believe or trust quite as much. So you might go to Breitbart to basically satisfy your sense of thrill and terror, but you wouldn't necessarily be swayed by their arguments. In a similar way, somebody's already sort of set in their ways might not necessarily find it very easy to follow an academic blog, no matter how accessibly written. And I think that is where universities will find even more of a challenge going forward, and in thinking more creatively about where knowledge is placed and how, and also how one does try to engage with critical minds.
Yeah, and I think when you do engage with broader audiences and try and say, well, what is the purpose of debate, what is the purpose of the university, and some of the stuff that Jan was saying just before about how do you create a citizenry who are informed, one of the things is to say, don't use these sorts of conceptual words uncritically. As you say, how's our scholarship going to inform debates over things like civilization? Is not that the word doesn't have its uses and has explanatory power and we can interpret it, but we can't just encourage its use in an uncritical, unthinking way.
So we heard quite a lot about civilization in terms of its conceptual underpinnings from a kind of history of ideas perspective. But it strikes me, kind of sitting in this room, which was designed as a library for a European king, that another way that Western civilization could be defined is consisting in a canon, and kind of following on from the last question and the idea of the university. If you kind of scan through most of the syllabi that kind of call themselves liberal studies or liberal arts, I know definitely here and in America, I'm not sure about other European countries, you find within about 3 or 4 titles the same kind of books being listed on each of these courses. And so how does this idea of a canon kind of loosely conceived, maybe Homer, Aristotle, Plato, they tend to be quite important, maybe Virgil, maybe Cicero, and some kind of national authors. So how does the idea of Western civilization as consisting in books that everyone's read, how does that play into your ideas?
I'll have a go. I think it perhaps relates to the idea of some of the, particularly to syllabuses in the United States that used to or still have the idea of the great books. And the great books certainly originated with the sense that what one was teaching was the humanities and ideas of Western civilization. I think most of the institutions that had run those sorts of programs have attempted in more recent times to encompass quite different sorts of works as well, to be thoroughly aware of what are the implications of focusing on particular kinds of work, and to be self-reflective about the nature of the canon. But there's obviously always much more that one can do in that regard. I know, for example, in UCL, there's a great interest in interlocking the work that's done, say, in my department, which is Greek and Latin, with other studies of ancient civilizations, or antiquity in a more global sense than the antiquity of the Mediterranean, or looking at the Mediterranean where one looks at the position of slaves in the economy or the voice of women. So one has ways of interrogating that I think are at work in the best cases.
Can I add to that? I mean, I think that's right, that these big sort of Western Civ courses are very much a product of the modern American university. And from one point of view, it's very easy to see that they're a celebration of imperialism and racism and dead white men and so on. But part of the ideology was always that this was the liberal arts education for a democratic society, in the sense that by the middle of the 20th century, among the elite, the intellectual elite that's running American universities, there is this widespread sense that the old moral traditions have run their course, that people used to look to religion or to academic philosophy or to the natural world for moral guidance, but different people have different gods, and Darwin tells us that the natural world is a pretty bloody and violent place, and the astronomers tell us that the cosmos, we're just alone in the cosmos, and so on. And you don't resolve any moral questions by turning them over to the philosophers, because the philosophers disagree among themselves. And so a great big part of the push for the idea that a university education might be organized around the reflection on this kind of canon was this idea that in the 20th century, democratic citizens had to decide for themselves in the absence of authoritative guides. So you make available to them a range of texts that various people at various times have thought of are worthy of serious reflection. And then you educate people through these texts, and then you say, well, now you're in the second half of the 20th century, and you have to make your own judgments because the older guides don't work. Now, from our point of view, we see that actually a huge number of ideological assumptions go into determining what that canon of works should be. But I think it is quite interesting to think about some of the educational ideologies involved, and it is, at least in part, to do with trying to think seriously about what an education for a pluralist democratic society should look like. And that's part of what pushes American syllabi towards this idea of teaching a canon.
Just a... No, turn around. Sorry, right at the back. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I have two questions. So the first one is, at the point you mentioned cultural relativism. I read earlier argued by Richard Brown, collective judgment can only exist in an environment of trust, expertise, and liberal relativism. So my question is, do you think the liberal relativism or cultural relativism could become a new dominant, or not necessarily, become a dominant consensus, replacing the pre-consensus built by excluding other values? And the second question is whether the most high-tech, like artificial intelligence, neuroscience, or astro-tech, or internet or new media, as initially a Western invasion, would help generate a way to continue thinking of Western civilization.
Well, yes, as an anthropologist, I think I should take the question on cultural relativism. That's a difficult one, but my standard answer is this. If you start studying seriously other cultures, if you are not a cultural relativist, you are an idiot, right? So that's the beginning. And then what does it entail? You know, what happens when you recognize that people over time and over space developed all kinds of solutions to all kinds of problems. And you will see tremendous diversity, and sometimes it's very even hard to find a common denominator. Well, there is a way to start looking at all those cultures and looking into some kind of basic solutions to the most fundamental questions, like decent life, protection of the basic values, some autonomy of either a group or an individual. Individual is not necessarily is there, but some sense of that here we are safe and so on. And then you go culture after culture and you discover that there are a lot of similar solutions at the level of what could be called, I don't know, ethical level. So cultural relativism is not the same thing as ethical relativism, right? So it is a very, very difficult balance, and it's always very difficult, and it always, I think, takes you back to the necessity of treating each other, obviously, with tremendous respect, and then trying to figure out things together. Right? So that's, of course, has been violated through history over and over and over again. But that's, I think, in a nutshell, in a few sentences, that's what you have to do. And it's possible. There are examples that it worked here and there from time to time.
Would either of you want to come back either on this or on the high-tech question? Jonathan?
Not on the high-tech one. I just don't know what to think about that.
Maria?
Oh, no, I just wondered whether anyone in the audience wanted to respond to that very interesting question. Yes, Thomas.
I don't have an answer to that question because it's a very complicated question, but it just seems to me that high-tech doesn't exist in an alternative space, but that high-tech always will exist in an echo chamber. To go back to Uta's point, high-tech will always represent the human intelligence that constitutes it. So even when it gets more and more and more apparently autonomous, at some point it exists culturally and socially and ideologically within a formation which will duplicate the kinds of structures that the panel has been talking about. So I can't see it going off into some kind of different kind of autonomous realm or providing a corrective or an alternative space through which to see things, because it will be instrumentalized and used within political systems that actually see it as kind of in a continuum with the kinds of issues that we're discussing. This comes back to bite us on the rear end in some way that we don't anticipate.
Well, if I may, just one thing, that, obviously I think we all know that there's the social media, say, is a double sword. I mean, on the one hand, it is a tremendous force for allowing people to mobilize. I study social movements and protests, so there is a change in the way people very quickly can take action, not possible even 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago, or something like that. But on the other hand, the fact that we are increasingly closing ourselves, which was the cliche we all are repeating these days, but that's what's happening with those kind of small worlds that we create and those echo chambers. So I don't know, it's going both ways. Both has an emancipatory power, but also has the tremendous power to divide us even more.
Can I quickly come into that just a second? I think the interesting point is also about artificial intelligence and algorithms and different sort of mechanisms in which there's a certain automated response to our preferences, and that this automated response to our preferences seems to be suggesting things that we might want to be interested in, that we might want to look at as well. So you make any purchase or any comment and you get suggested what else you might want to look at, which will ever more reinforce the position in which you are in. So when it comes to questions of what you believe about values, about political organization or anything of the kind, that's where I see the sort of the downsides of tech pushing us into a direction which will facilitate a reification of our views rather than a kind of exposure to new ideas. Sorry, I cut you off,
Well,
Christopher.
I mean, just with my sort of, everything we see at the moment as a rerun of things from the 18th century hat on, what I'm reminded of, I mean, one of the things people sometimes think about when they think about the internet and the way in which, well, one of the themes that comes up is this idea that English becomes inescapable around the world, that so much of the communication that goes around on the internet is English, and either you have access to it or you don't, and that plays a very important, that has a very important dynamic. And in a sense, that raises the technological story as different, but it maps onto an issue in the 18th century, which is that in the 18th century, the international cosmopolitan language was French, and if you wanted access to that polite international culture, you had to be able to speak and read and write French. And one thing we shouldn't lose sight of is that, if we want the classics of European literature, one of those novels that sometimes does, often gets onto top 10 lists and often tops those top 10 lists is Leo Tolstoy's novel War and Peace. And what the theme of that novel is it's the story about how the Russian elite learns to speak Russian, that it's not an accident that the opening, much of the opening pages of War and Peace are in French. You often don't notice this if you read it in English translation, because the translators translate both the French and the Russian into English. But if you're a Russian reader reading War and Peace, this is what you're struck by, that the opening conversations are all in French, because this is how the Russian aristocracy talk among themselves. And part of the great ideological story that Tolstoy tells is how the realization that General Bonaparte is not a liberator, he's a conqueror, he's not a symbol of civilization, he's a symbol of barbarism. That is the catalyst that helps to create a new Russian community that is a Russian-speaking community where both the elite and the people speak the same language. So these issues about languages and the kind of responses you get to international hegemonic languages, we've been here before, and it'll be interesting to see whether we go through similar processes in the future. If we get another novel as good as War and Peace, that will be a bonus.
Just to add on to that last point, just what strikes me, and just in Jan, in relation to what you were saying about being the only social scientist in the room, often within the debates within the universities, of course, the humanities are even in a worse position, and particularly art. I think if we think of at the level of practice, visual arts, performing arts, literature, that is the space where historically the dissenting voice, the disobedient voice, the new languages have emerged that crack open the conventions of thinking. And that is what is really under threat when you talk about the NEA and the NEH or whatever, within the US in particular, being seen to be so dangerous that the funding has got to be drawn from them. And we may not be quite at that stage in this country, but there is a kind of Philistinism and an anti-intellectualism and an anti-creativity where the only way in which the arts are judged is about money and markets and, what they can bring in terms of audiences and theatre tickets. And I think that's where one of the real battles lies. So the irony is, of course, that, that the arts are often subsumed under the category of civilization, but at the very moment that civilization is seen to be under threat, it's the arts that are mostly undercut because they're also so very, very dangerous in terms of talking truth to power and dislodging conventions of thinking. So that's where I think there's a real battle to be fought.
But the NEA and the NEH have their survival strategies, and on the one hand, it's the figure of Big Bird. It's the fact that Sesame Street is funded in part through public money that gets mobilized to generate thousands of calls to congressmen whenever that budget is under threat. And the other thing that the National Endowment for the Humanities does is it's always careful to plow money into scholarship on the founding generation, on the American Constitution, on the founding fathers. And so when conservative politicians begin their attack on the NEH, again, they're able to say, but you're striking at precisely the heritage you most care about. And in the end, what Congress has always done, we've been here before with Republican attacks on these budgets. And what always happens is the amount of pressure that these organizations are able to generate in the form of phone calls and petitions and so on to members of Congress set against the absolutely tiny budget savings in the grand scheme of things means that Congress always backs away. So Trump will bluster on this, but I think these are agencies that know how to protect themselves, and we shouldn't exaggerate the threat to these streams of money.
Yeah, but at the same time, they are using political strategies to defend themselves that determine some ways how that cultural production is going to appear and what subjects are going to be tackled and what are not. So I think you're speaking to the same issue, that this is very political, and there is a huge amount of space in all forms of cultural expression for dissent and so on. But of course, when you're trying to protect public organs from political attack, you're going to have to use political strategies that may well minimize the sort of dissenting voices that you might ideally in a society want to have. And I just would add that this country is on the same slope, and not just at higher education level, where you do now have the marketization has got to the stage that only if students sign up to things will they really realistically survive in many places. And even in high schools now, every sort of minority subject is disappearing from the curriculum because there's no funding for them to be maintained. And we're not just talking about subjects that have long been under siege, including classics and so on, but we're talking now about modern languages of all kinds, Spanish, for instance, which no one could say is insignificant for us to know, and they're all being cut out. So it's a real issue.
I think we're probably sort of already over our allotted time technically.
I think we probably are, and I think there's also a slight awareness, certainly from me, that it's getting cold in here. So I think this is the moment where we might be able to warm ourselves up at the reception, and also perhaps first to thank our speakers for a very stimulating discussion of some really quite complex issues.